My memory of us is, ironically, incredibly forgettable. You play as two children who go on an adventure in Nazi Germany, or Poland? With the backdrop of World War II, you'd be forgiven for assuming that the game will leave you in desperate need for a hug after traversing through a heartwarming yet gut-wrenching story. Unfortunately, the zombie-like gameplay and simplified puzzles devour any potential emotional impact. How are you? Welcome to another episode of Random Steam Games. Today we look at My Memory of Us, an indie puzzle narrative adventure title that was co-developed by Crunching Koalas and Juggler Games, and as of the making of this video retails for 25 AUD. Crunching Koalas surprised me by not being Australian, or at the very least an angry Kiwi. They are, however, based in Poland and have contributed to some pretty big games such as Darkwood, Gwent Thronebreaker, and Frostpunk, just to name a few, while Juggler Games, also Polish, have only one release game in their catalogue, that being this game. They do have one game to be released in September, The Amazing American Circus, or as the rest of the world describes it, An American Election. Now, this is the fourth episode in my Random Steam Game series, and it's the third indie title that I've happened to speak about. I have nothing against indie studios. It's incredibly difficult to be noticed in an oversaturated market, and making a video game is equally very difficult. However, if you're willing to charge money for it, then it's more than ready to be judged, even by arseholes such as myself. It's not all bad though. In fact, there are some very strong positives. The first and most obvious is the art style. It's simply gorgeous and reminds me a lot of Steamboat Willie, back when Disney was still creative and, well, still racist. Seriously, I really enjoy the art direction that was chosen. It adds a whimsical nature to a game based on one of humanity's darkest moments, with the background often telling its own story. One particular artistic choice that I really enjoyed was having robots in place of Nazi soldiers. This again adds to the theme of a Germany during World War II as seen through the eyes of a child. Another positive note is fucking Jean-Luc Picard as the narrator.
And decided that I was going to tell her a story, a robot story.
Who is simultaneously underutilized and overused while sounding very bored. Anyone who has listened to Sir Patrick reading A Christmas Carol, which understands the character and emotional narration he can bring, and yet it sounds like he's reading lines of a book that was written by someone who isn't a native English speaker. Although I suspect that he just doesn't get video game voice acting, because, let's be honest, he sounded equally as bored in Oblivion.
No, he is not one of them. He can help us. He must help us. They cannot understand why I trust you. They've not seen what I've seen. How can I explain?
I went to stay at her grandfather's house, where the old man was confined to a wheelchair. We played and laughed and ate together like a new little family. To earn my keep, I would help around the house and garden. As her birthday was soon, and as I was such a brilliant thief, naturally I would teach her to steal a cake. And so, one day, we returned to the city.
Let me explain my comment of being used too much, but not well enough. And for this, let's dive into the negatives. The voices. There are none, and that's perfectly fine. Ain't nothing wrong with that. This is an in-studio after all. A tight budget leaves little room for voice actors. What we have instead is that Banjo-Kazooie style of speaking. Just gibberish, but in My Memory of Us, this Kaldawash is coming out of a child's mouth. At least for me, it sounds very grating. Every time I began to be immersed into the game, these sounds would jarringly pop me back out. Put yourself in the shoes of the developers and you get Professor X to do your voice work and then have him do 10-second narrations. And that's actually about it. He often only provides a single sentence of narration before we're given the same information via the game. This doesn't make sense. Why not have him narrate the entire game, or at least those certain crucial moments, something akin to the Stanley Parable? This would add to the storytelling, as if he was truly remembering these moments from his childhood. We don't have to worry about the player not understanding what is required of them, because we have these little images that pop up to help explain the situation when Ian isn't available. For me, this just feels like a huge missed opportunity. Sir Pat was born shortly after the beginning of World War II and lived through it. He's gone on to say in many interviews that the war had a lasting effect on his childhood, as it would, so he was the perfect fit to provide an impactful narration over the game. He could have really added some depth to the already heavy story, and yet I was left with an empty cup. The story, as I said, has many moments that leave you feeling hollow, as you imagine yourself in the character's place, even if the sum of the parts are less than the individual components. I'm certainly not disregarding the dreadful experiences that so many children and adults alike went through at the hands of their fellow man, but that also carries with it a certain amount of weight. We are all aware of the heinous crimes the Nazi Party committed during their reign, and therefore certain expectations are placed upon any story that occurs during this period. And for those reasons, unfortunately, I feel as if the game buckles under the weight of it. I'm going to play some footage now, and this is the first real moment that kicked me in the breadbasket. You watch as your friend is dyed red in an almost too long of a sequence. With her Jewish heritage on display, a short cutscene shows us how certain people in the public treat her, and from here on out, we see how people are affected by this in the background of our main characters. If this doesn't get to you, then shit, fuck knows what will. But these moments are spread out, and you're often spending the majority of your time bored. The puzzles are simply too easy, and often the only challenge is trying to figure out how to do something rather than what. Not too shortly after the aforementioned moment, you arrived in the ghetto, and again, the game's visual storytelling shines, but as before, this moment is quick, and the gameplay here is just as boring, and immediately brings us back down to reality. Oops, there goes gravity. I have a special treat, a snippet of my live reaction to the gameplay. Enjoy. The slow nature of gameplay isn't exclusive to a single point in the game. How unfortunately, the entire title is boring, and I haven't even begun to describe the controls, but fuck it, here you go. Have you ever played the guitar before? If you have, then you must remember the first few times you pressed against the strings and how much your fingers ached. That sums up my experience with the controls. I'm playing with the default control settings, which is how the developers intended, and God only knows why. If you or your loved ones have arthritis, please avoid this game. In truth, the controls aren't that terrible, but there's a lot of odd choices that contribute to an overall unpleasant experience. An example. You want to climb over a box? Great. Then press the button twice. Holding it does nothing. It's a small thing like this that adds up. It's at this point in writing the script that I wondered if I was being far too negative. Perhaps I was taking out my frustration on the game. After all, I hate my 45-hour-a-week job. It was then I watched a video by Strife Hayes, in which he discusses the challenges of games that take too long to engage the player and ultimately lose the player base. Of course, he's highlighting this issue with MMOs, but the point he makes stems across the entire video game industry. I'll link his video below as he's a fantastic content creator. Now, let's take a look at the Steam achievements for My Memory of Us, and we see the issues that I have with the game aren't exclusive to myself. With only 65.3% of players holding the hand of the other character, something that is done within the first 30 minutes of playtime. From there on out, it only gets worse, with only 38.6% of players completing the first chapter. That's a drop of roughly 46% of players. Almost half of the people who ever played the game left before finishing the first chapter. My Memory of Us isn't poorly rated either, with a very positive score on Steam and a 77 critical rating on Metacritic. Critics and some players clearly enjoy it, so that begs the question, why the sudden drop in player retention? The game released on the 9th of October 2018 for Steam. That was the same day as WWE 2K19, with Assassin's Creed Odyssey releasing the week prior and Call of Duty Black Ops 4 releasing the week after. Certainly a tough time to be releasing. However, Return of the Obra Dinn released on October 18th of that same year, with Dark Souls Remastered and Soul Calibur 6 releasing the very next day. That's also 6 days after Black Ops 4, and yet Return of the Obra Dinn managed to keep gamers playing for far longer than My Memory of Us, despite the unique, often polarizing art direction and lack of voice work. So, if the release window isn't entirely to blame for players losing interest, then what else could it be? Let's discuss story versus gameplay. Every game needs a combination of these two elements, but not necessarily in equal quantities. You can have a higher ratio of gameplay than story, provided the gameplay is fun and engaging. Take Among Us. Among Us has very little in the way of an overarching story. The story is created by those who happen to be playing the game. The gameplay of Among Us is simple, but engaging and often quite thrilling. It's therefore safe to assume that the percentage of gameplay versus story is vastly higher for gameplay. This same method works for Return of the Obra Dinn. The gameplay is also quite simple, and yet this time, the percentage of gameplay versus story would be higher for the story. Although we have rudimentary gameplay, the whodunit narrative is engaging enough that it drives the player forward. So, you can have very little story, so long as the gameplay is appealing enough to keep your players playing, or adversely, you can have very simple gameplay, but an engaging story that players are transported into the world and don't think about the gameplay. Now, let's apply this to My Memory of Us. The game certainly drifts into the high percentage realm of story, but the gameplay is slow and boring. That in turn shifts the focus of the player to the story, yet the story, although it certainly pulls at the heartstring, crawls along. So now we have meandering gameplay and a story that's drip-fed to us. That's a problem. And unfortunately, regardless of what the subject matter is and what you choose to focus your game around, if the players are constantly reminded of what they could be doing rather than what they are doing, your game will inevitably be lost to the void. I take no pleasure in having a go at smaller indie games, but when you're charging $25, which is the same amount of petrol I put in my car every 10 days or so, I'm not going to take any prisoners. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like or comment. If you didn't enjoy it, then please like it 3 times. Take care out there. See you later.